We currently find ourselves in the period of Sfiras HaOmer. And one of the most basic halachos of Sfiras HaOmer has to do with our posture as we count. The Shulchan Aruch says, based on the Rambam, that we are to count while standing as opposed to sitting. Shulchan Aruch says, V'tzarech lispor me'umad. You have to stand while counting. While it may seem like a minor detail of this mitzvah, and certainly a minor detail in the scheme of all the halachic practices we're engaged in at this time of year, there is something which I find to be quite special about standing for Sfiras HaOmer. It's an act that I find particularly relevant on this Shabbos between Yom Hashoah and Yom HaAtzmaut, as we contemplate the great tragedies of Jewish history, as well as the human triumphs and divine miracles of our time. The halachic rationale for standing during Sfiras HaOmer seems to derive from a statement made by the Rosh, one of the major codifiers of halacha in Ashkenaz in the 14th century. The pasuk in Parashat Re'eh describes the timing of the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer as follows. Shiva Shavuos Tispor Lach, you should count for 7 weeks. When does it start? Mehachel Chermesh Bakama. From the time you begin, Hachel, Lehatchil, to begin, Chermesh Bakama, where you put the sickle to the kama, the standing grain. The Gemara in Menachos says that word, bakama, the standing grain, indicates that the omer must not be brought, the omer sacrifice must not be brought from cut grain, which is lying down, but must be harvested from grain that is still attached to the ground, so that it can be cut for the sake of the mitzvah. The Rosh, however, cites a brisa, Tanaitic statement, which interprets this word bakama more homiletically than the Gemara in Menachos. The Rosh says, when you say the bracha, when you count, you have to be standing. Why? The Tanu Rabbanan, because our rabbis taught in a brisa. Our rabbis taught, bakama techel lispor. You should continue or start to count bakama with the standing grain, and al tikrei bakama ela bikoma. Don't read bakama with the standing grain, but rather a similar word, bikoma, with you standing up. Not the grain standing up, but you standing up. From the fact that the grain was standing when we start the count, the fact that the Torah specified it in that way, we learn that we have to stand when we count. This drasha cited by the Rosh sounds like your run-of-the-mill, totally unsurprising, classic rabbinic analogy which makes a linguistic connection between two words in order to teach a halacha. Al tikre kama, elakoma. What is surprising is its provenance. The commentators, starting from the contemporaries of the Rosh and up to the 20th century, all note that if you search through the entirety of Shas, all of the Talmud, and all major midrashim, you will not find any such brisa at all. For example, the Torah Tamima says, Ve'echshehu ein brisa kazo b'shum makom. After quoting the Rosh in his brisa, he says, somehow there is no such brisa that exists. I looked everywhere. There isn't one. The brisa is an enigma. It's a brisa of mysterious origin. Rabbi Yosef Karo in his Kesef Mishnah commentary to the Rambam says, based on statements of the Ritzgeis in the 11th century, that the Drasha must have been an oral tradition from the times before the Rosh. And when the Rosh says, Ditanu Rabbanan, the classic introduction to rabbinic literature, to a brisa or a Tanaitic statement, he must have been using the phrase Tanu Rabbanan more loosely than usual. He must not have been quoting an actual text of a brisa, because it doesn't exist, but simply telling us in a more vague sense, Ditanu Rabbanan, our rabbis of old taught this concept, this idea. Today we have the luxury that they didn't have in the 15th century. We have almost every medrash and every other source in the world in electronic format in the Bar Ilan database. And the truth is, if you search for this brisa, this text, you will actually find a statement in a medrash Tanaim on Sefer Dvarim. It's unclear whether the Rosh knew about this medrash or perhaps knew of an oral tradition or perhaps just intuited this very important drasha. But certainly for centuries they never knew about it. Despite the fact that for centuries they had no idea where the Rosh got this drasha from, the drasha became so well accepted that almost every Rishon after him quotes it verbatim. It became deeply entrenched in the thoughts of the Rishonim, even though its origins were shrouded in mystery. Not only does it become accepted and quoted, but it becomes so well known and so foundational that it's actually used as a halachic basis and model for why we stand for other mitzvahs as well. This enigmatic Drasha, the enigmatic origins of this well-entrenched practice of standing for Sfiras HaOmer, has long fascinated me. Whenever you see a tradition begin and take root very strongly despite its lack of textual support, to me, indicates that there was something extremely compelling within this drasha that resonated with the rabbis of all generations. There was something that drew them and fascinated them about this drasha to the point that they were perpetuating it despite its faulty provenance. Why was this drasha so important to Jews throughout the centuries? What did they see in the practice of standing for Sfiras HaOmer that was of such great symbolic significance? What is the deeper meaning behind the connection between the standing grain used for the Omer sacrifice and us standing for the recitation of Sfiras HaOmer, the counting of the Omer? Although the Rosh in his halachic commentary is quite terse, the Hadar Zekanim commentary on the Torah, which is a collection of statements from the Tosafists of his generation, adds slightly more nuance that perhaps can give us a pathway to understanding this practice. The Hadar Zekanim explains, Al Tikri Bakama Ela Bakoma, he quotes this drasha, Shekol Maaseh HaOmer Ba'amida, Lefikach Anachnu Mevarchim Al Sfiras HaOmer Ba'amida. He adds those few words, Shekol Maaseh HaOmer Ba'amida. It's not just that there's a word in the Torah, Bakama, and it's similar to Bekoma, but somehow because the whole instance of the grain offering of the Omer happened Ba'amida, we stand when we count Sfiras HaOmer. It's not just the linguistic similarity of Bakama and Bakoma that compels us to stand for Sfiras HaOmer, but something about the experience or the procedure, the Maisa HaOmer of the farmer cutting standing grain, not lying grain, but standing grain, that we are trying to mimic when we stand to count the Omer. I believe that the standing grain provides a real-life illustration of the journey of the human experience and provides a message of hope to all who notice it. The standing grain that was to be cut for the Omer sacrifice represents the hope that a human being is capable of standing again after they have fallen, of standing again against all odds. Those cutting the Omer were meant to be struck by the grain standing straight and tall and meant to recognize that this was far from a given. Throughout its precarious growth, it was unclear whether the small seeds of grain that were planted would actually rise at all. They had to take root in the soil, they had to get sufficient rain in the right season and begin to sprout and get enough balance of sun and shade and water and tending by the farmer to successfully begin to grow. Then as a young stalk, still weak and soft, it might have been beaten down by the heavy winds and rains over the winter that threatened its very survival, but somehow it regenerated. It developed a harder stalk that could allow it to finally mature and stand up tall once again. Just like that grain, the human being also undergoes various stages of maturation and growth in life, and at every stage their existence is precarious. At every stage, we fall and we falter and we trip and we stumble and we struggle. We're pushed down into the side and we weather every storm that comes our way, but yet somehow we manage to pick ourselves up and carry on. Somehow we manage to persevere against all odds and eventually muster the strength to stand again. That's not only the story of life of the individual and of course the story of the Jewish people as a whole, but specifically the story of the Jewish people during the period of Sfiras HaOmer that commences with the cutting of that symbolic standing grain. When we count Sfira, we are supposed to recognize the trajectory of our people that they took during this time, from the mud pits of Egypt to Har Sinai, from Pesach to Shavuos. We are supposed to recognize that life for us at this time was not a given. We're supposed to recognize that we were low and beaten and weak, weathering every storm and every taskmaster and every brick in Egypt. And we're supposed to recognize that after all of that, Mekimim Yafardal, after Hashem helped us to get up, we rose to stand on our own 2 feet and to reach the loftiest moment of revelation at Har Sinai, in which we not only stood tall and proud and strong and rejuvenated, but also ready to serve a loftier purpose in this world by carrying the mantle of Torah on our back. Just like the grain, we fell so many times and yet emerged standing. The Rosh and all the other Rishonim perhaps, and I know this is just my guess and just my belief and just my intuition, but perhaps fell in love with this enigmatic drasha of Al Tikrei Bakama Elabakoma, because they understood that by standing up for Sphira, we would imagine ourselves to be like the standing grain in the field and remember that its story is our story, hoping that we might draw tremendous inspiration that could lift us and fill us with confidence that no matter how often and how hard we fall as individuals or as a nation, we will have the strength and the tenacity to stand up again and live. This message of the standing grain comes to life for me through an unbelievable story of spiritual heroism during the Shoah. Rav Menashe Klein was one of the greatest poskim of the 20th century. He was born in Ungvar, Czechoslovakia in 1924. He was a survivor of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, was liberated alongside Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau and Elie Wiesel, and brought to France after the war. He later emigrated to the United States, eventually to Israel, where he died in 2011 at the age of 87. His magnum opus is a 10-volume series of halachic responses, shilos and shuvos, that cover just about every single halachic issue that arose in the 20th century. In the 10th volume, Rav Menashe Klein recounts his experience on his last day in Buchenwald. The night before liberation, he was attacked by one of the Nazi guards and got a bad head injury, which actually saved his life, since he lay on the ground bleeding and the guard thought he was dead, so he left him there alone, allowing him to live until liberation. On that night, the night of the 28th of Nisan, the night of April 11th, 1945, the last night under Nazi occupation, he says, Leil Chavchas Nisan, Haita Halayla Ha'achrona, Tachas Hanatzim, Vikvar Nechalashti Me'od. The 28th of Nisan was the last night under the occupation of the Nazis, and I was already very weak. Ad shelo haya bi koach, I had no more strength. V'shachavti ala krashim, I lay on the wooden planks of the barracks. V'lo haya li koach lamod lisfiras ha'omer. I had no strength to stand up to count the sfiras ha'omer. Va'afilu leishev lo haya li koach. I couldn't even sit, let alone stand. Va'amarti az l'she'er basar she'aya shochev lemuli. I said to the piece of flesh, the skin and bones, my fellow inmate that lay next to me, Ein li koach od lamod. I have no more strength to stand. Mikomakom anase od b'kol kochi lismor sfiras halayla. I will try with any strength I have left to count the sfiras ha'omer tonight. Ulamachar. And the next day, the same thing occurred. Ulamachar ein li od koach lismor. Ubekol kochi achazti b'shtei yadai. Ba'amud. With my 2 hands, I grabbed a pole, I grabbed a column. V'itzlachti leishev. I successfully sat up. Uveirachti birchas sfira. And I said the bracha on sfiras ha'omer v'safarti miyushav. And I counted the sfira sitting down. Umiyad nafalti b'chazara la'krashim bli onim v'koach k'misalef. And I fell down on the bed with no more strength and no more resolve. Beintaim. Amnam hayirios hafsiku v'nasa shuv sheket. All of a sudden, he says, the shooting stopped outside in the camp. It was quiet again. I peeked my head out from hiding, liros manasa b'chutz, to see what was happening outside. I saw one of the inmates running around with a white sheet on his shoulders and on his hand. He's saying to everybody he meets, we're free, we're free. I didn't believe him. put my head back. I waited a little bit longer. Ad sheshamati kruz al haramkol, until I heard them calling from the loudspeaker. Wir sind frei, wir sind frei, wir sind frei. Anachnu bnei chorin, anachnu bnei chorin, anachnu bnei chorin. We're free. כששמעתי זוס יצאתי מתחת הברק מלוכלך בלוטית ורפש מלאתית ורפש. At that moment, I left the barracks, which was filled with filth and dirt. Ve'lo haya li koach lismoach. I didn't even have the strength to be happy. Ela ra'isias al yad hamachana. I saw next to the camp, over him, tanking Amerikayim. I saw American tanks, American soldiers. V'yadati shebe'ezras Hashem yatzanu lecherus v'nasu na'asenu b'nei chorin. I knew that we were free. I knew we were liberated. I knew we were free people. Menashe Klein was so weak from years of servitude and from his head injury and from emaciation and malnutrition and from hard labor, he could hardly stand on his own 2 feet. Nevertheless, he said to his bunkmate, he would use every ounce of strength to pull himself up, just to sit, to stand a little bit, to stand for Sfiras HaOmer. I can't help but feel as if Rav Menashe Klein didn't just stand because he wanted to fulfill the mitzvah to its fullest in standing form, but he was driven by something more. I can't help but feel as if that he was imagining the standing grain that he was trying to mimic, and that it is that standing grain that gave Rav Menashe Klein the vigor to stand up in that moment and live, just as the Rosh had hoped it would. Perhaps deep down Rav Menashe Klein understood that just as the grain stood again after facing every atrocity, so could he. Rav Menashe Klein literally lived the message of the standing grain, which we are meant to embody when we stand for Sfiras HaOmer. He was so low, he was unsure he could ever rise again, but forced himself to stand for Sfiras HaOmer. And stand he did. In those final moments of captivity, he could not give in, and he could not give up. In those final moments of captivity, he drew strength from the notion that standing for Sfiras HaOmer meant that he, like the grain, would survive, and that he, like the Jewish people counting from Egypt to Har Sinai, would devote himself to loftier purposes. In the moments afterwards, he was liberated. That night was the 28th of Nisan. That fateful night, he stood to count the 13th day of Sfiras HaOmer. This Shabbos, tonight, is the 28th of Nisan. Tonight, we too will stand in Mirz Hashem to count the 13th day of the Omer. What a powerful moment this can be for all of us. On this Shabbos between Yom HaShoah and Yom HaAtzmaut, on this night of the 13th day of the Omer, we stand surrounded not only by the image of the standing grain and the image of Rav Menashe Klein in the barracks of Buchenwald, but by the events of last week and this coming week. We remember the stories of heroism of survivors of the Holocaust that we heard this past week on Yom HaShoah, who gave everything to rise again and continue to live even as they had lost everything, even as they were defeated, even as they were haunted by the unreal traumas that the Nazis perpetrated against them. And we anticipate the stories of the heroism of the pioneers of Israel that we will hear this coming week, stories of people who gave everything to rise again and raise a nation and bring about the greatest miracle of our time. I can't speak for all of you, but I can say for myself that those heroes and those real life stories of standing grain that survived and stood will fill me with hope and optimism about our prospects for the future, and fill me with pride and gratitude that inspires me to stand and to rise alongside them no matter what I go through in life. I can't speak for all of you, but I can say for myself that when I stand for the 13th Sfiras HaOmer tonight, they are the ones that I will be thinking of. Shabbat Shalom.